This video will show you how to remove and replace the shock from a FLEXpod and FLEXpod-HD. If you have the HD version, the tools you will need are a 5mm hex key, a 13mm spanner, a 13mm socket wrench, 2 small bottle jacks. The ones in this video are 175mm when lowered, some loose cardboard or grippy material, some lanolin grease, and we recommend grippy gloves, especially if you live in a warm climate. For regular FLEXpod, you only need 2 bottle jacks, which should not be left for any length of time with the release valves unscrewed or they may leak oil, some loose cardboard or grippy material, and optional gloves for added grip. If you have a regular FLEXpod, you can skip forward to the next step. Starting with the HD version, the top reinforcement plate needs to be removed. Begin loosening the black bolt slowly to avoid seizing using a 13mm spanner and socket wrench. Then, with a 13mm spanner and a 5mm hex key, remove the stainless countersunk bolts that have the thick washers underneath. With the same tools, remove the final countersunk bolts. The nylock nut at the bottom must be gripped using the open end of the spanner. Do the same to the other side. Remove the top plate. Place some cardboard over the metal parts at the bottom of the suspension to prevent scratches. Then lay the base of the jack on a 30-degree angle. You want to make sure that the jack is as far inside the suspension as possible and is flush against the small wall on the inside. Pump the jack until it's just about to touch the top of the suspension and slide in some cardboard or grippy fabric to protect the surface. Once inserted, raise the jack some more until the jack is firmly pressed against the top of the suspension. It is very important to make sure that the suspension isn't being raised by the jack at this point. Do the same to the other side. When raising the jacks to remove the shock, make sure that each side is being raised the same amount. You want to raise the jacks by 3mm on each side twice to increase the overall height by 6mm. Look at the top of the suspension to make sure that each side is raised equally throughout the process. Place one hand on the lower, thinner part of the shock, gripping firmly. Make sure this hand is preventing the thin rod from twisting, while with your other hand, loosen the thicker part of the shock anti-clockwise until it becomes difficult to twist. Stop here and increase the height of each jack by 3 to 4mm. Repeat this process 3 more times. If it is hard to twist the thick part of the shock after the jacks have been raised, this means they are too high. If you experience this, lower them by 2 to 3mm and try loosening the thicker part of the shock again. After loosening the shock for the 3rd time, keep twisting until the thread at the top makes a click once per turn. This means the thread is all the way out of the rod end. You should be able to see the exposed thread by looking from the top. Take the new shock absorber and screw the thread of the thin side 3 full turns into the outer side of the top rod end. When you screw the shock in, Make sure the thread is directly in line with the rod end to prevent cross-threading. Use this as a lever and gently rock the rod end. Use your free hand on the shock in the suspension to pull upwards and use the shock on the outside to pull down, freeing the old shock from the rod end. Unscrew the new shock that was used as a lever. Tilt the rod end outwards to create a clean path for removal. Then, focusing on the bottom, fully unscrew the shock from the bottom rod end anti-clockwise, taking the washer with it. Take your new shock absorber and make sure there's a rubber washer on the thin rod. You'll also want to get the metal shock washer close by as it's needed for the next step. Slide the new shock absorber into the same place you removed the old one from, making sure the thick part is at the top. You can rest the shock here if you need to adjust your position. Slip the shock washer over the thread with the rounded side facing upwards and screw the base of the shock all the way into the bottom rod end. Make sure the thread is directly in line and the rod end has not moved to avoid cross-threading. Stop when you feel resistance. Grab the top rod end and pivot it down so the thread is horizontal. Using the old shock you just removed, screw the thread of the thin end into the outer side of the top rod end by 2 to 3 full turns. Gently lever it while with your other hand push down on the new shock and you will feel the thread pop into place. You can now unscrew the old shock. When fastening the shock, tightening the top results in the bottom unscrewing. For this step, make sure that both threads of the shock are screwed in an equal amount between each rod end. Focusing on the top, spin the shock clockwise while holding the top rod end, ensuring that the thread is in line and won't cross-thread. It should feel fairly easy to screw in. If it doesn't, unscrew the shock and try again, making sure that the rod end and the thread of the shock are directly in line. Release the jacks, shrinking them by a few millimeters equally on each side. Focusing on the bottom, spin the shock clockwise until you see the bottom of the shock is screwed in all the way. Then take your hand and grip the thin rod at the bottom firmly. The purpose of the lower hand is to prevent the thin rod from twisting while the top is being fastened. With your other hand, grip the top of the shock and spin this clockwise. Twist until some resistance is felt. Repeat this step again. Repeat this step again, but when lowering the jacks for the third time, don't close off the release valve. Instead, push down on the top of the suspension at the point where the jacks are touching. This will lower the jacks down to the point where the suspension is sitting in its natural position. Close the jack's release valve. And twist the shock again in the same way, tightening the bottom, then the top. The jacks can now be fully removed. Finally, check that the shock is fully fastened by giving it a twist. At this point, it may only need slight adjustments and should sit firmly without being able to twist. Check that the thread of the shock is fully fastened in each rod end at the bottom and top. There should be no visible gaps. If you have a regular FLEXpod, the shock replacement is complete. If you have the HD version, the reinforcement plate can now be reinstalled. Place the reinforcement plate on top of the suspension with the angled part at the rear covering the grooves. The first bolts to go in are M8 by 40mm at the front of the suspension. Before dropping them in, push the plate forward from the rear. This will allow the holes to line up nicely and makes inserting the remaining bolts easier. Apply a dab of grease on the bolt threads before placing nuts over them. From underneath, place a nut over the thread and hold it in place while fastening from the top with a 5mm hex key finger tight. Do the same to the other side. Now the countersunk M8 by 25mm bolts can be dropped into their holes, followed by thick stainless washers and nylock nuts finger tight. Use some grease on these threads before placing washers and nuts. Moving to the back, take the two black M8 by 40mm bolts and make sure the black washers are placed over them. Poke them through the holes at the angled back. Take the black T-shaped washers and slide them over the thread of the black bolts. They should be orientated to make an upside down T. Follow this with nylock nuts finger tight. Now everything can be properly fastened, starting at the front with a 13mm spanner and 5mm hex key. Remember to use the open end of the spanner when fastening this bolt. We recommend fastening all of the bolts to 5 Nm of torque. Then the shorter bolts near the back using the same tools. And finally, the black bolts at the back using a 13mm spanner and 13mm socket wrench. The suspension is now fit for use.